Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Benyon. I'm a professor of political science and founding director of the American Democracy Project here at IU South Bend. The American Democracy Project is a nonpartisan civic education and engagement project, and our aim is to produce graduates equipped with the knowledge, skills, and values required to make a meaningful difference in their communities. Another one of our goals is always to develop partnerships with the broader community, and we are delighted to be co-sponsoring this Civic Leadership Academy with the St. Joseph County Public Library. And this is the 5th event in the Civic Leadership Academy. We've explored the importance of facts, the difference between stating a claim and making an argument, how to spot fake news, and how to refute unwarranted claims that a story or a station is fake news. We've talked about the best way to contact elected officials at multiple levels and what citizens need to know about policymaking at the local, state, and national levels. Today, we will focus on what happens when official channels don't seem to be working, or if you're seeking to build a movement or public awareness for your cause. We'll talk about protests, the when, why, how, and also a little bit about why protest by itself is not enough to sustain a movement for social change. Our moderator for today's event will be Andy Trowbridge. She is the lead intern for the American Democracy Project, but also a senator with our Student Government Association and president of the Political Science Club. Andy is active in numerous student organizations and community organizations. The Take Back the Night rally and the Clothesline Project, highlighting the problem of domestic violence, are just two of many recent public awareness campaigns in which Andy has participated. Andy is the recipient of this year's John M. Lewis Award for Civic Engagement, given to one outstanding student each year in the Department of Political Science. And we could not be more proud of the work that Andy has done in organizing voter registration drive, public forums, candidate debates, presidential debate watch parties, a diversity reading program, and more this academic year. I'll turn the microphone over to Andy in just a second, and she will be moderating this evening's outstanding panelists. But first, I wanted to remind you, fill out your event survey one more time so we can track your attendance. And also, you'll see a form there for those of you who have earned the certificate. Let us know how you would like to receive it. I also want to refer you to the excellent set of handouts we've provided this evening. They should prove very useful. I want to thank Sue Kessem for this links to track issues of interest to you and resources. These are many of the same things that I've mentioned and some others throughout our sessions together. So it's a very useful guide, and we'll make that available to you online as well. I also did bring more copies of the League of Women Voters Citizen Guide with the contact information, election years for elected officials in St. Joseph County, and the dates of all those public meetings that elected officials have been mentioning over the past 2 sessions. So if you didn't get one of those on your way in, you can grab one on your way out. A reminder, if you were unable to attend all 4 of our previous sessions, you will be able to access the video on our Facebook page or through our Facebook page, IUSB ADP. So facebook.com IUSB ADP. And next week, we'll have one final session where we'll put it all together, discussing a comprehensive plan for identifying, defining, and solving community problems. We'll have another terrific set of panelists, so you won't want to miss it. I also want to invite you to plan to stay a little bit after the session next week. We'll have a reception, and we look forward to talking with you more, doing some networking, thinking about what topics we might want to cover in the future, thinking about what projects folks in the room might want to pursue together. So do plan to stay for that. We look forward to this opportunity to network and share. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andy and our outstanding panelists. Each of them is very well known in our community for their incredible skill, tenacity, grit and determination in gathering people together and in making their voices heard. So welcome to all of you and to our panelists.
We're going to begin tonight by having the panelists introduce themselves. So I ask you to tell us a little bit about your background so we can better understand your views and experience in the area of political protest.
Okay, I guess I'm first. My name is Tony Flora, and I'm a labor guy. I'm the AFL-CIO president for this area, but I've been an active trade unionist in this community for at least 35 years. My background is that I was a postal worker, a letter carrier here in South Bend, and I'm still a proud member of the National Association of Letter Carriers. That's my home union. That's what I've been committed to. So my political activism has grown out of the labor movement, and it remains there because that is at the center of the work that I do.
Okay, and Tony has delivered mail to my house.
Yes, I have. Retired now.
My favorite mail. So I'm April Ladinsky, the Director of Women's and Gender Studies here, and I grew up in a labor home. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado. My father is a plumber. So I grew up marching in labor parades and thinking about structural inequality through the lens of labor. My first protest I went to with my mother in 1983. I was one of 17,000 people who encircled the Rocky Flats plutonium trigger plant, which was leaking toxic waste into the water of Broomfield, Colorado. Being downwind was real, and that experience of holding hands with complete strangers taught me a lot about some of the protests that I'll talk about a little bit later on, but standing with strangers, holding hands, listening to somebody play, to trumpeters play taps. They were located about every 300 people right on the front range, seeing people use symbolism like covering faces with bandanas, which of course did not protect anybody from nuclear waste. But it was a visual that really stayed with me, and that experience, I'm a secular person, but it felt like what I imagine church or a temple or being at a mosque feels like for people to stand with strangers and to feel like you're on the same page. So I'll talk a little bit later about the activism that I did in college, but I was part of the anti-apartheid protests of the mid-'80s and went on to do gender-based activism both in college and here in South Bend as well. But that was a galvanizing moment, and I feel really lucky that I shared that with my mom.
I'm Monica Tetzloff, and I teach history here at IU South Bend, and the history of social movements is one of my primary areas that I teach in. I've led the Freedom Summer Tour for many years now, where we visit civil rights sites and talk to people who were part of protests and part of organizations that changed America. And I'm very happy that I'm together here again on this panel with Andy Trowbridge, who was on that tour and really an outstanding student and leader in that context. We try to make that tour a community in which everyone participates, and I love the fact that Dr. Benyon said at the beginning that this is about more than just protest. It's about protest as a piece of solving problems and organizing and building community. My experience with protest began when I was in college, and I and some students formed the Hunger Task Force, and then we felt that we needed to move beyond letter writing and calling and organizing fundraisers to speaking truth to power when Jerry Falwell came to my college, and he was really advocating some policies that increased hunger and homelessness. So we protested outside of his speech, and then when I got inside, I got to ask him a question, which I think was really just as good in terms of getting publicity. But as we said, this is all of a piece. Since then, I've been on the picket line with Tony Flora. He was very modest there in introducing himself, but he has done his part certainly here to galvanize people, as well as April Ladinsky and Eli, who you'll hear from soon. So I've been a participant with many of them on peace demonstrations, demonstrations for immigrant rights and for the rights of workers and the LGBTQ community. So I look forward to what they have to say, and I hope I can add my 2 cents.
My name is Eli Williams. I was born and raised in South Bend, and I'm proud to call this complex and beautiful place my hometown. I'm also the executive director of the LGBTQ Center. We're a nonprofit located right down the street at 1522 East Mishawaka Avenue. Our vision is that we are a community where everyone is valued, respected, and empowered. And I'll say our mission statement because I think it really sums us up in a nutshell, and that's that the center promotes equality, builds community, and increases understanding of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and queer experiences. We meet these crucial needs through educational resources, support groups, social events, and enriching programming. So we're doing all sorts of things in the community. We've been huge advocates for hate crime legislation. Indiana is one of 5 states without hate crime law, and this is simply unacceptable. We see a lot of people coming in the center. We probably see 100 people every week, with about half of this population being teenagers. So we're working with a lot of youth, and that's a big, the heart of what we're doing at the center right now.
All right, thank you very much. The format to continue on is going to be a little bit informal. The panelists are going to speak about, on questions that I ask that they feel comfortable speaking on, and pass when they feel that the other people on the panel could better answer that question. So we're going to move on with, we're going to do a little bit of history here. So historically speaking, can you talk briefly about the importance of protest as a way to change political culture and public policy?
Okay, I guess I'm supposed to start. Well, thank you. Monica was very kind to say that she's been at protests with me. I was at a protest today, which is why I don't mention them, because it's really the last protest that counts. And today's protest was at Congresswoman Walorski's district office regarding her failure to really engage the community about her vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, that we protested that, right? Now, let me use that as a kind of situating and giving you a context. I was there because for organized labor, we were strong supporters of the Affordable Care Act. In labor, it's not simply what happens at workplaces and particular employers. We're also a major force for advancing socioeconomic justice, because in the world of labor, we view that as what we call the social wage. So the Affordable Care Act was very, very important to us. To give you a framework, obviously for organized labor, it's been those great protests that have made a decisive difference, both for particular unions, for the workers' movement, but also for our country. And let me give you a good example, which is something I use very frequently, because one of my other union jobs is still organizing people to become members of my union, the Letter Carriers Union, because in the Postal Service, we have to sign up each person individually to agree to pay union dues. So that's one-on-one organizing that I've been engaged in for 30 years in this community. And in the past, easily 10 years, the major pathway I use in talking to people is, and I bet very few people in this room are aware of it, which is the Great Postal Strike of 1970. Anybody in here remember it? David, he's a ringer. Here's another ringer. Largest illegal strike in American history. March 1970, about 400,000 or 500,000 postal workers go out on wildcat strikes, completely illegal, shut down the U.S. mail for over a week. President Nixon attempts to run the post office by using Army troops, actually marched troops into post offices and tried to have them do the work. It collapses. There's a tremendous victory. Now, if that is not a lesson as to the import and the ability for protest that's outside the normal bounds to do something, that's a great example. But then to bring it back, as I was saying before, about to something currently, perhaps, and I think some of you were here, we were also at some recent protests for UAW Local 9. At the very plant, at the very physical site in which the first great sit-down strike in American history occurred, right here in South Bend at the Bendix plant on Westmore in November 1936, actually preceding the Great Flint Strike by several months. And why were we there? Same issue, and that is Here was a major corporation trying to force their own employees to go backwards on their standard of living. So, you know, the historical perspective of protests for organized labor has gone in two basic directions, not two different directions, but are two major currents, and that is one, issues around workplaces, whether it be the sit-down at Bendix or the Great Postal Strike of 1970, but also because those issues spill out into communities, and that's why we have to be a force for advancing what we call the social wage. Now, so today's protest around the Affordable Care Act is because labor fought long and hard to extend health insurance to those who cannot acquire it through their workplaces. And now we have to defend that. So in this case, the AFL-CIO is part of a coalition that's working on that same issue, which is a Northern Indiana Community Coalition for Healthcare. So that is kind of a historical perspective of what organized labor has done and how my work around these kinds of public protests has been focused on both issues about workers. Now, when you mentioned, I don't want to go through the list of the number of protests. I don't know how many rallies I went to in this community about Save Our Jobs. Plant after plant closing down, the quality and the standard of living going down. In my career alone, from the early 1980s, a lot of protests around Save Our Jobs. So my work in labor has been protests around workplace issues, the social wage, issues around what are our national policies about the standard of living for our communities. And so we have to use a variety of methods, whether it be, I mean, as a labor person, I have done both. I have been in the halls of Congress as a lobbyist, believe it or not. That's what I would be considered, visiting members of Congress to ask them to vote on a particular bill. And I believe there are photos, streaming behind me. Some of them are of postal workers, if you've noticed, and allies marching on Congresswoman Walorski's office, again, about a particular bill that was going to affect how the Postal Service operated so that their jobs would be secure and so that also communities would have quality public postal service. So we do that. We go to the halls of Congress and actually talk to members of Congress, but all of it is to affect policies, laws, legislation that affect people's lives. And most of our protests are about ultimately having that kind of political power so that we can preserve our standard of living. One of the great results of the postal strike of 1970 is that because we were so militant and so successful in 1970, postal workers are the only public workers in the United States governed by the National Labor Relations Act, which is the federal law that governs all private sector workers. If you're an employee of the state of Indiana or Indiana University, you have no rights under that law because you're a public worker. We are the only public workers under that law. Why? Because of our militant strength in 1970, which has been continued because we know how to continuously organize and keep that pressure going. So that gives you a little historical framework.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next question. So we have time for a question and answer, unless there's another panelist wanted to add something to that.
Well, this is, I think, maybe Monica's big, the historical background is probably pretty important. So I'm going to pass because everything that I'm going to talk about later really builds on the civil rights movement. So.
Okay, great. And I am going to pass on some others, so please pardon me while I take a little bit of time here. I'm glad that Tony started us off with labor organizing and protesting because a lot of the lessons in how to organize a protest for other groups came from the labor movement, and the labor movement was very much allied with the civil rights movement. I want to begin, though, with the women's movement and the pickets that you may be familiar with in front of the White House during World War I, drawing attention to women's lack of the right to vote. And there had been a lot of lobbying, there had been peaceful organizing in terms of petitioning and other things, but the publicity, hadn't really gotten to the point where the pressure was truly on. But by picketing on the sidewalk in front of the White House and then being arrested for those provocative pickets, the signs were provocative, and against the president and in favor of women's rights. And when those protesters, like Alice Paul, went to jail and then went on a hunger strike, that got some adverse publicity that really helped to push the president and Congress to ratify the amendment for women's right to vote. So some of that nonviolent protest starts as early as those times. Labor had been picketing in the various ways that Tony has mentioned, and the NAACP worked with labor sometimes, and sometimes labor unions were not helping black rights. But in the 1930s, that was a time when there was some radical activity, and some of those tactics crossed lines. I think you're probably most familiar with the civil rights movement and its effectiveness in the 1960s, so I'll touch briefly on that because this question does come to what has been successful. So in the 1960s, the sit-in movement was successful in part because it was so well organized, that there were plans beforehand as to which places to do the sit-ins, and there were pickets at the same time. There were boycotts at the same time. There were sympathy pickets in the north, including here in South Bend, fight against lunch counter segregation in the south at chain stores that had stores in various places. There was, interaction with getting the media to those events. So the sit-ins integrated the lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, where they started, in Nashville, Tennessee, where there was a wonderfully organized movement with training by Jim Lawson of college students. And they really, as I said, scouted out the places. There would be a leader who would be there, who would be the spokesperson. There would be scouts and lookouts for people who might come and rough up the protesters. There would be scouts who would report what was happening with the police. In some ways, really well-organized protests are like military operations. The aim isn't to kill someone, but the aim is to keep your people safe and to keep from being shut down. So also reinforcements, will come in when the first wave might be arrested. And you plan beforehand to have beautiful signs, to have signs that are clear and meaningful. So all of these were part of the sit-in movement and part of what made it successful. It was also a success because it galvanized the activists, even in the cities in the Deep South where there was no success in the 60s. Students became activists, and they united in a network called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then they began to plan actions in a national sense. And their next move was the Freedom Rides, where they supported another group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, that had had a freedom ride on interstate buses in 1947, when the Supreme Court said it was illegal to segregate on interstate buses. That freedom ride had only gotten through the Upper South before massive arrests and police brutality stopped that freedom ride. They were trying it again in 1961. The law was still not being enforced. And they did, through massive waves of students who were just fearless, finally get the federal government to enforce that. But it took a lot of pressure and hundreds of lives and reinforcements, and really a courage to face death if necessary, because the buses were firebombed, the students were beaten. And all of this was captured on camera, usually, which made it very dramatic. I also want to point to then the 1963 Birmingham campaign, where the children took part. The young people made such a huge difference, being in the streets protesting against segregation. And then Sheriff Bull Connor used dogs and fire hoses against those young people, and that was caught on national media. But before that happened in 1962, there was a well-organized protests movement in Albany, Georgia that got almost no publicity, and nothing changed there. Some of the lessons that were learned in that context were used in the next campaign, and that's also part of organizing protests, is learning what went wrong and how to do it differently the next time around. And segregation did change in Birmingham, and the president did step in in 1963, including jobs for African Americans in the downtown. One often thinks of just, the lunch counter segregation and things like that, but jobs, as Tony has said, it has been an issue for all of us for so long, and access to jobs. So the civil rights movement is a great lesson in effectiveness of protest, especially when those in power just aren't budging. And I'll talk in the next part about advice about organizing, about when you move from negotiating to being out in the streets. But it usually takes both. It takes contacting people within the system and then also pushing on the outside and being a bit noisy and provocative in order to gain some attention for the cause. Another one that I want to speak of historically is the peace movement against the Vietnam War. Certainly it wasn't protest alone, and sometimes when protests turned violent there was a backlash, but the numbers kept growing at the demonstrations. When veterans joined the demonstrations, that was really key. So sometimes it's who joins and who is invited that also makes a big difference. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on with, like you said, advice. So can you give us some advice about organizing a protest, and what tips do you have about organizing, attracting participants, and crafting your message? April, do you want to start with this?
Sure, I'll say a little bit about what I learned at college, an anti-apartheid protest, because it really has shaped what I've done since then. So the rule number one is don't reinvent the wheel. So this was in long ago times before the interwebs. So I was at the University of Iowa. This was 1985, and if you were around then and following the news, you know that divesting universities' interest and investments in South Africa was kind of the social movement that people were involved in. So those of us at the University of Iowa, I was part of a group called the New Wave. I had a shaved head on this side and Duran Duran bangs. I pulled it off. So, but what we would do at the University of Iowa was to get on a telephone attached by a wire to the wall and call the University of Wisconsin at Madison and say, what are you doing today? And so the student groups were in touch with one another, and we weren't making everything up. We were seeing, what are you doing with your administration? How are you organizing your tent city? We had 300 tents that we'd organized outside the university office so that we would be a physical presence that never went away. We got ideas about chants. We got ideas about news briefs that we would use. We got the idea of a hunger strike. I was one of a group of hunger strikers, and because there was a group of us, we made it onto the news in a way that we might not have otherwise. So that taught me a lot about contacting the media, using the media, getting ideas from other people. I also learned sort of the hard way how to do homework. So just a quick anecdote, we were, this was this time of year actually, right before finals week. There were hundreds of us surrounding the president's office. President Friedman had said that he would not divest interests in South Africa. We were marching, and there was a group of men standing on the side, and I was so fired up, and one of them said to me very nicely, so tell me a little bit about what the students are marching for. And I was like, the dean won't listen to us, blah, 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 we're out here, we're never gonna go away. And he was like, oh, that's so interesting, thank you very much. And then I went and joined the marchers, and then my friends ran over to me and said, oh my God, what did you say to the dean? That was the dean. So I had no idea. And kudos to him that he didn't call me out and call me a moron, and instead sort of let me have my moment. But it also kind of made me think, like, why didn't we make an appointment with the dean? And you said before to think about all different kinds of power, and I guess it really hadn't occurred to me that we might be able to make an appointment with the president of the university. And my guess is his hands were tied in a lot of different ways, and he probably would not have immediately capitulated. And it was because we were part of such a large movement, and universities kind of fell one by one then. But that's something that I really took with me, that you should actually always assume that you can and should have a seat talking to people in power, and that might not be the only thing you could do, but it might be the first thing you could do, and it might have saved us a lot of labor. Would have been less fun, but I might have gotten a better grade on my last Shakespeare paper. So anyway, I can say a little bit more about that, but I thought those, not reinventing the wheel, learning from others, and assuming that you might begin by speaking truth to power and then using protest for publicity in other ways were things that have definitely shaped other kinds of activism that I've done since then.
So thinking of tangible things as well, I just want to stress the importance of social media as the token millennial on the panel here. That you need a Facebook event. I can't describe how powerful Facebook events have worked in activism I've been part of. We had a vigil for Ferguson, and we got over hundreds of people there within 24 hours because of a Facebook event. There was a Facebook event for this event here tonight. So I think in those events, it's really important to make it look as professional as possible. On your cover photo, there's a website called Photor, F-O-T-O-R, that can help you design a cover photo with the exact right dimensions and to have it look really professional.
Eli's a genius at this.
So I just think it goes a long way to have a well-crafted, well-written Facebook event. And it's also engaging with other social media platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. So we found that at the LGBTQ Center, the teenagers were not seeing things on our Facebook because they're not on Facebook. It's not cool anymore, I guess. Now you have to go on Snapchat. So we got a Snapchat because that's the way that we can communicate with that population. I also think coalition building is incredibly important, and that's something I've been so impressed by in South Bend, especially after the election, how much people have come together. But I think that there's a difference between diversity and inclusion, and we need to be aware of that difference. So diversity is having all these organizations co-sponsor and you put them on a list, and that's all good, but inclusion means that those people and those organizations are there from the very beginning and part of those conversations. I had a conversation with my friend Jamie Morgan today, who reminded me that you don't necessarily need to have tangible goals to have a protest. You can just have a protest because you're mad as hell, and that's okay. And that does things, and to go back to historical perspectives, one event I was reflecting on is the Stonewall Riot of 1969. So this was a gay bar in New York City, and in the 60s and onward, still happening today, I'm sure, police were raiding gay bars, rounding people up, arresting them, counting how many garments of male or female clothing they had, and they were being LGBTQ people were being horribly mistreated in prison. So one night a police raid happened, and the patrons at the Stonewall and this gay bar decided enough was enough, and they had a riot. And Obama was the first president to recognize Stonewall and make it a historic landmark, but one thing he said at the dedication ceremony was, raids like this were nothing new, but this time the patrons had had enough. So they stood up and spoke out. The riots became protests, the protests became a movement, the movement ultimately became an integral part of America.
Thank you very much. Move on to one of the major points of a protest is to gain visibility for a cause, and you can't get your message out there if everybody's gathered but nobody knows that you're there. So what are some tips that you have to attract the media to your events?
That is a very complex question, and it's complex because it is determined by the message that goes to the media. Depends on what it is that your protest is about and what you're trying to achieve. I think there's a basic rule about protests. Is there's a famous story, whether or not it's true, but everybody quotes it, so it sounds great, it's probably true, which is Sidney Hillman. Sidney Hillman was a famous labor leader in the 1920s and 30s. And the story is about Franklin Roosevelt. And that when Roosevelt he's been elected and they're all trying to do all this New Deal stuff and all that, and that Hillman is supposedly really agitating Roosevelt. He's at the White House saying, well, we need to get this done, we need to get that done. And FDR apparently, supposedly turns to him and says, it's all a great idea, Sidney. Now you go out there and make me do it. The story is, the point of the story is that there's two things that either the person of power is somewhat susceptible but needs that political support to accomplish what they need to accomplish, or you're going to make them do it because they're opposed to it. So given that fact, that's what's going to help you craft that message. What are you trying to accomplish there? And both organizing and the message go hand in hand. What you're trying to, because ultimately what you want to do is not just have your crowd of people standing around like that, but it's the image and the message that gets out beyond that that matters. You don't have to talk to the people who came to your event. That's why they came, because they support that idea. But they are going to be the device that's going to get out to either the person in power, who's going to be able to say, you see, I got to do this because the public is demanding it, or, let's say, our event today with our Congresswoman, for her to eventually feel the pressure that this community wants and needs the Affordable Care Act or its improvement, not its destruction. So we're trying to do the same thing. So that's the message. That's what's going to help you craft that message. Who really are you talking to? Well, with most of these events, we're not just talking to ourselves. And also, here's another thing. Now, this particular event that I selected, that was in April 2011, which was a We Are One rally, which was not about a specific bill, a specific issue, but simply labor saying we want to unite as much as we can in the community about general principles that we all adhere to. We are one, I am a man. We use some of the slogans from the 1968 Martin Luther King-led Memphis sanitation workers strike, which is where he died, fighting for workers' rights. That was a general kind of message, which differs from the one in which there are postal workers marching to Congresswoman Walorski's office about some specific legislation that was going to affect their employer. So those messages are going to help you how you talk to the press. Rule number one, talking to the press. Very simple, very simple. 90% of your press release is going to be in the subject line of that email you're sending out, because that's what's going to grab the attention of the people in the media business or the media jobs. They're going to have to make the decision whether or not they're going to cover something or not. They need to see something that is arresting, and also you have to understand that they're doing their job. Their job is selling interesting stories. So you have to give them an interesting story. You can't make your message exhaustive. It has to be very succinct and to the point. Or as my old labor studies professor, Keith Canals, used to say, brief but brilliant. Always brief but brilliant.
No pressure.
So, no pressure, exactly. You got to get it into that subject line. You got to get it into the first few lines in which you're describing your press release, and really the first and second paragraph. After that, you've lost the press. You're not writing essays for people. You're not writing books. You got to make it very, very, and that's a real skill, and also it's a political task, because you have to, with your colleagues and allies, know exactly how to distill and get it down to the essence of what you're trying to accomplish. Not easy.
So I'll piggyback on that just very briefly, and I'm looking at Jamie Morgan, who has helped write fantastic press releases and find the word that I couldn't find, and also say, don't use that word. Use this one instead. So to make it easy for the press is a really good thing to do. So whether you craft your own press release and send it out, be friendly to the press, be a good interview. I think a lot of us who've been working on reproductive rights activism now are in the reproductive justice activism. We're in the, folks in the press have our text, have our cell phones, and so they know they can call me. I can't always be the person to be interviewed, but I'm a network. I can say, yeah, Jamie's out of class. Go ask Jamie. Sorry, Jamie. So being a good interview, doing outreach that way. To connect to something that Eli said earlier, of course, all of us are now social media, so making hashtags that people at the event can share and be tweeting live, sharing periscopes, making sure that everybody at that event, because of course you're right, the audience is not the people at the event, although the energy at the event is crucial, but making sure that every single person there is a hub of sending information out to others. Follow me, follow us on Periscope, Eli, was that live, Facebook live feed from the city council meeting, so that there was media going out, citizens activism media. So it's a lot easier now. I will say the telephone is still, at the Women's March, just 15 seconds here, the Women's March, which drew over 4,000 people here in town, was a success in part because of the Facebook page. But we also ran it in the newspaper with my telephone number, and the number of people who called me who were age 70 or older, from Buchanan, from Shipshewana, from Fort Wayne, who said things like, I saw it in the newspaper and I have a walker and I can't march, but can I come and sit with y'all? Those folks are not on social media. So there's a lot of different audiences, and right now you have to do all of the things.
I was going to say a lot of things other people said, but I think
Will you
also...
talk about calling a press conference, though?
Yeah, I can talk about that. One thing I wanted to say is have your list of media contacts ahead of time, because this day and age you have to be able to act right away. So we have a running media contact list that has the general email of each station, as well as the reporters we have a relationship with. And April asked me to speak about a time Pro-Choice South Bend called our own press conference. When there was something came up and we needed to have quick action, and we met down at Sites Park and we all stood up there like real official, but we just called our own press conference, and the press came. We didn't even need any other people because it made a great photo op, and it worked out really well. So you can call your own press conference, and anyone can do that. But you have to keep in mind that the news stations are getting like 50 press releases a day. So that subject line does make a really big difference, like Tony was saying. Like, we had a rededication at the center, and Mayor Pete came and cut the ribbon. So the subject of every press release was Mayor Pete will cut the ribbon at the LGBTQ Center. And really that's 5 minutes of the event, but that's the 5 minutes we knew would get the press there. But I don't think that we have to assume that we need press to have a good protest. With social media, we have so much power, and a lot of times the media come and do stories and they don't do a good job. So social media, having these hashtags, being in the newspaper, all of this is really important. I just want to echo what everyone else said as well.
We'll go ahead and move on. And I just want to say that we decided not to kill any more trees than we already have for this series. We were going to provide you with some examples of some press releases. Those will be available on our Facebook page if you would like to look at some examples of some press releases. And I'm going to move on to tips on staying safe. While violence, injuries, jailing, and even death will certainly attract media coverage, few protesters actually want to risk life and limb for a cause. We have a handout with some tips from the ACLU about how to protest safely and effectively. It details legal rights as well as a guide for staying safe, including appropriate use of photography and videos. And we ask that you just please read and consider these tips. And one thing with going to a protest is you not only have rights, but you also have responsibilities. And so that handout is very important to read. And I have actually participated in several protests. At one event, the police were called by the organization we were protesting. The police arrived and spoke with them, and then came to talk to us. The officer thanked our group for making sure we were not only staying well out of the way of road traffic, but also making sure that foot traffic was also not blocked. And then they left, and we continued to protest. So, for my panel, what tips can you give participants and organizers about staying safe, alive, and out of jail at a protest or on a picket line? Or perhaps tips for how to prepare oneself for the possibility of physical violence or imprisonment?
Do you want to weigh in there?
No, we're going to pass this
Well,
to
let me just offer this. I believe there is no such thing, really, as a successful, unplanned civil disobedience. If you're going to go out to do a protest, the first thing the organization has to decide is what kind are you going to do. Are you willing to do a civil disobedience thing, in which that takes a whole nother set of plans? But if you're going to go ahead and say, no, that isn't our purpose, we don't think that's going to serve our purpose, and those are important political questions, then you decide to do what you want to do. Now, sometimes you do things in which there is a little flexibility. That We Are One rally, that you're occasionally seeing those pictures, people holding those signs, We Are One. We decided that, I think in that, we actually marched from the Civil Rights Center which had just opened, I think, in 2011, or pretty much around that time. And I think we marched there, and the plan was to end up at that time, it was Congressman Donnelly's office, which is the same one he uses for his senatorial office there on Colfax. And so, our plan was we were going to march down Washington, et cetera, and King Drive and all that jazz. Back then, that was King Drive. And we did not really go to the City of South Bend Police to ask for the permit to march in the street. But we figured if we had enough people and we started to do that, we will do that until it really became a point in which they're going to tell us not to do that. But we are in a community in which there was, let's say, an unspoken support for what we were doing. And the police came along, and they said, well, really, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll block a little traffic off. You're going to be through here in no time at all, and it worked. So, that was a semi-planned. We were clearly, if the police said, don't do it, boom, everybody's on the sidewalk, and we do it the right way. If I remember, at the Women's March in January, that pretty much developed that way. We didn't anticipate those thousands and thousands that we had, in which case we had a problem crossing people.
Yes,
right?
the police did know that this was going to happen.
Right.
And then handily, Lynn Coleman was one of our speakers and began directing traffic.
Right.
But it really, I think partly that happened because the tone was so
Right.
clearly positive. There at no time at that event did it feel like things were going to get violent. And so I think they didn't feel at risk. People were happy to see the police as helping. So the tone of that event really mattered.
Yeah, but we stuck to the plan, that because we did not tell the police we were going to do that. We kept that relationship. When they said, okay, make sure people cross at a certain time, we did that. Mm-hmm. We had not, that organization had not made the decision, no, we're going to do that anyway because we want to achieve something else. Like I said, sometimes you can be a little flexible, but as I said, do not think that, we'll just have civil disobedience and see what happens. That's not going to serve your purpose, and it's not going to work.
So if I can talk very briefly about two contrasting experiences. So in back to 1985, when we did want to get arrested and were successful. So we were trying to make some noise. Again, we were following Madison, University of Wisconsin. And so for 26 hours or so, we occupied the president's office in Jessup Hall in the center of the Pentecrest in Iowa City. I love this tiny detail because I was a budding women's studies scholar, and you may know that at the Seneca Falls Convention, the first women's rights convention in the U.S., these wonderful women planned all the things except no one got the key to the door to the Wesley Chapel. Like, oh crap, they couldn't get in, and so they had to send some little kid up through a window to unlock the door from the inside. So at the University of Iowa, I was that little kid. I scaled up to the second floor of the outside of Jessup Hall, and I broke in through the window, and I got to be the person who led in all of the protesters. And so we planned to stay until we would get arrested, just as they were doing on other campuses. So that was planned. We planned to have civil disobedience to go limp when we were carried out. As a result, we were featured on Nightline. It was very successful. And because there were about 137 of us, we were held for a little while, and then they just were like, oh, God, you kids get out of here. So I don't have a police record. They released all of us. And so making sure that if there had been 10 of us, we might have, something different might have happened. So we were very organized that way. Just as a brief contrast, the Rally for an Inclusive Michiana, which we held here on the Saturday after the election, was very studiously a peace rally. So there was a feeling that people wanted to gather. And you may recall those days right after the election, there were absolutely anti-Trump rallies. That's what they were about, and they were often violent, and it was making news, and things were on fire. And so we really had a heavy hand in the tone of that event. Jamie was a major organizer, and Karen and Tony and the head of the mosque here. So we did we were very careful in saying this is not an anti-Trump rally. It was a rally for an inclusive Michiana. And in our social media, we said no anti-Trump signs. We were really pretty heavy-handed. And it paid off. I think we got good press. It felt good to be there. It felt very healing. With the Women's March, we also had to kind of balance the fact that we were a sister march. The national organization had a platform that we really adhered to, but we had people with more diverse experiences saying, well, I'm actually against abortion. Can I march with you all? And we made the decision here, absolutely. If you're part of the community and you want to show up for women's rights, we welcome you here. The idea is coalition here, and good things came of that. Friendships came from that event. But we, again, really reiterated, this is a peaceful gathering, it's positive, it's all ages. We encourage people in really hard times to include signage that's uplifting, that calls people together. So it was very studiously crafted. And, the weather helped. It was absolutely gorgeous if you were there.
For January.
It would have felt really different if it had been raining. But I think that event, in part was a success because of very heavy hands, really, on saying this is what the tone is going to be. If you want to be here and show up for that, please come along and join us for this kind of event.
Mm-hmm.
And, I want to once again echo what everyone else said, but all the protests I've been to in South Bend have been safe and had no violence, and we all want to keep it that way and be safe and not get arrested. But the reality is sometimes people get arrested. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested 30 times. So it might happen. And I think we need to look at who is most vulnerable and help protect those people. So I went to a Black Lives Matter protest here, and at one point the organizers called all of the black individuals there, people of color there, into the center, and the rest of us stood on the outside. And that model of you literally using your body as a shield and allowing a space for those most vulnerable who need to talk at that moment, have that space to talk. Of course we want to keep protests safe, but at the same time, police brutality is a very real issue in this country, and that's coming out at protests. So we also need to be willing to put our lives on the line because this matters.
And I just wanted to add something from that, I'm not sure whose idea it was, but I know that it was Eli that was doing it. At the Women's March, since there were so many people there, it was hard for people to hear the instructions, and so what they did was, the organizer gave the instructions about, when, that we're going to be waiting to cross, and then everybody in the crowd was supposed to echo, so that way these 4,000 people, way in the back could hear, and that's just, and a little inventive tip on how now you can deal with a large group of people, and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing.
Human microphone.
Yeah, the human microphone that came from the Occupy movement, so it's very handy, repeating back. Again, it feels sort of like a secular sacred.
It also feels like you're talking to third graders. Obey all traffic laws, obey all traffic laws.
Eli did a great job. Somebody had to do it.
But I learned it from Occupy because I saw a video of Judith Butler doing that at the Occupy Wall Street movement, and then we heard people couldn't hear us, so we started doing that.
Yes.
Yeah, it worked brilliantly. I was standing in the very back, and I knew exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And I didn't actually get to start marching until half the crowd had finished because there were so many of us. All right, I'm going to move on to I want you guys to, if you have just some brief ideas on this one before we move to the last question. Some of you have spoken just a little bit on what people can do if they can't be there, because sometimes people support a cause, but they can't attend the protest due to other commitments. Maybe they have a non-participation requirement from their job, physical limitations, or even concerns about being photographed or recognized by opponents to the cause. So does anybody have some tips on just ways that somebody can still help out the cause if they can't actually attend the protest or the rally?
Well, I would offer, my experience in the world of labor is that in unions, you have a very wide range of people. And some are going to be activists, and some are barely going to be activists. There are people who will never show up at anything. There are people who won't even attend their local union meeting. And there are others who will be at every single one and will come out for everything. The same is true, and certainly in my work, when you're trying to organize something like, there's some sort of public thing. There's a role that everyone can play. You can always talk to your membership or the people you're trying to recruit from. There is, for instance, letters to the editor. If you can't come to the event, you can do things like that. And of course, like now you can do things on Facebook. You can tweet things. You can do this and that. There's a lot of different things. But the point is to try to find something for everybody to do. In the world of labor, I'm very proud. And I say, hey, you're paying union dues. Money is important. I can't do something, can you financially support what we're doing? And some people can do that. There's always something for people to do, and part of organizing is reaching out and finding that. And making sure that everyone feels as though whatever they're contributing is certainly deeply appreciated, and it's building the movement, even if you can't come to the rally, or you don't like going to rallies.
So I have a couple of things to say, but do you want to, either of the two of you want to weigh in first?
I'll throw in a little bit. Part of the thing that kept people going in long kinds of campaigns for a goal like the Montgomery bus boycott was mass meetings in the evening and singing together and telling each other's stories and listening. That wasn't geared for the media, and it wasn't a protest, but sometimes when there's a long strike or a difficult long boycott, or you just keep losing, keeping the spirits up of those who are part of things, baking cookies, I mean, it can be as simple as taking some food to the people who are doing the heavy lifting, or someone who's gone to jail, helping their family, helping financially, or helping with any kind of spiritual, emotional support. There are many, many roles to play.
Yeah, as someone who lives with a disability and chronic pain, I really appreciate this question, because sometimes it is hard to show up. But there are a lot of other things that you can do. There's a slam poet I really like named Stacey Ann Chin, and she has a very young daughter who's like 3, 4, or 5, but she has a YouTube series called Living Room Protest, and it started because they wanted to go to a protest, but Zuri, her daughter, was very young and couldn't make it, so they made a YouTube video, and now they just protest various things like Planned Parenthood. We want to support Planned Parenthood. We support immigrants, and they have these different topics that they do in their living room protests. So I encourage you to watch them. They're hilarious too, because this girl's like, revolution, she's super funny. So, but there are also other things that you can do. Once again, these tangible things are what I'm thinking about. So you can provide childcare for someone who's at the protest. You can drive people to and from the protest, because it's really annoying to find parking oftentimes. Making food. And Gloria Steinem has a title of one of her books called Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions. And for me, that just feels like a mantra. That it's not even really about showing up to these protests. It's what can we do every single day to have an active protest. And to me, that feels incredibly important.
So do I have time to say just a tiny bit? So this is actually linked to something that came from an earlier question as well, which is what makes a successful protest or rally. And part of it is including people who are there. So the idea of a successful protest is rarely, you show up with a sign and I'll be the one at the microphone and you all can just stand there and listen. That is a bad protest. So, so the things that people can do who can't show up are often similar to the things that you can offer people to do who do show up. So, for example, at our Equal Pay Day, we always have a minute at the microphone. We have very brief speakers at the beginning, but we open it up so that anybody who comes knows that they can have a minute at the microphone. So if you can't show up, you can do that on social media. What's my minute at the microphone? What's my story about equal pay or workplace injustice? Hashtag, we had at the Women's March, a Why I March. We actually ended up not having any speakers at the front. We just had an open bullhorn. I keep thinking that's such a sexist term, an open cow horn. So, megaphone, yes, I think is the correct term. But so that anybody had an opportunity to speak, and some people wanted to, and some people didn't. At the Equal Pay Day rally, your daughter got to say a little bit, but through the virtues of social media, you can have a hashtag campaign that's searchable, and people can tweet. Planned Parenthood has done that very helpfully with their Pink Out days, where you watch the sort of hashtags of people telling their truths. Giving, a good protest gives people something to do next. So flyers that say, here's the address of your local Congress folks. You can share that online and people can write those. I'm going to give a shout out to Andy Turbo, who had a great letter to the editor this week. I was squeal at the breakfast table, upsetting the cats and enthusing my family when people have great letters to the editor. But again, you know, you want to make sure that people show up and leave with something else to do. Sue has been very good at making sure that that happens, and that's easy to share through social media, so folks have something to do as well.
Just because I like symmetry, we're going to round this out real fast with, we started with history, so we're going to end with history. Just briefly, Dr. Tetzlaff, I'd like you to speak just briefly again about the Freedom Summer experience that I went on last summer with you, where you talked about nonviolent disobedience, civil disobedience. And just, do you think that that kind of tactic is useful today? Can you just, you know, connect it back to what's going on right now?
Absolutely. I think it's still useful today, and I'll try to make some connections between the past and the present here. I also want to give a tip for getting more information about what to do next. There's a great website called Waging Nonviolence, and it's organized by, among others, a Quaker named George Lakey. And I'll say a little bit about how he and his daughter Ingrid Lakey organized a protest, and that is, first of all, to find out among those who are taking part who can get arrested and who can't. I mean, who is a single parent, who has a felony record, and making sure those people are protected. That's very similar to some of the people that we learned about in history in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That they would meet at 6 in the morning if they needed to. They were students, you know, they had classes, but they would get together at those times to plan exactly who was going to do what. For example, the action that my husband and my daughter took part in against PNC Bank a couple years back there, funding mountaintop removal, and the organization called Equate brought in a busload of Quakers who were gathering conveniently for a Quaker gathering, and had done some training there first, and it included all ages. As you can hear, my daughter was about 3 at the time. And so some planned to sit on the sidewalk, which was legal in the public space. And my daughter actually started to say, "Let's sing This Little Light of Mine." You know, and just like historically, those things were very moving. The grown-ups were also pretty moved, you know, by this historical song, and they sang together, and they even sat in silent worship until they were told to leave the area. Now, others had planned to make a little pile of dirt and then chop the top off right on the bank floor. And for that, they got arrested, because you're not allowed to do that kind of thing on the floor of a bank. But it was very well planned as far as the symbolism to be covered by the media, and I wasn't part of that planning, but I'm sure that they contacted the media to make sure they would be there for some of the key moments that might capture people's interest. And throughout, those who are the leaders, not to, you know, always be up there at the microphone, but listening to what the people want. I mean, sometimes the protest itself can be an occasion to listen, but the organizers that we studied, you know, would say that, like Septima Clark and Diane Nash would say, the listening starts months before you ever have an action. You hear what the problems are in the community, you build relationships, you build trust, you hear, and then you talk about how are we going to solve these problems, and you reach out to leaders like maybe the dean and you try to negotiate. But then when that fails, as Martin Luther King says in his steps that a nonviolent campaign takes, and these steps are outlined in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which is publicly available everywhere on the internet, then you go into street action, but you prepare in a nonviolent protest to purge yourself of the feelings that might make you fight back in anger and harm someone, and do that sort of mental and spiritual preparation. Or you say, you know, I can't do that kind of thing. I am going to be a supporter. I can't be nonviolent. But I think we are continually seeing, you know, that kind of action can yield to results. Not always. Sometimes we need to elect people because they're just not listening to us, no matter how effectively and symbolically and beautifully and in great numbers we protest in the streets. If there isn't anyone who cares to listen, that's a problem. But I know this Civic Leadership Academy has addressed that issue, and that people should run for office, and that's another piece. But for protest, I think it still can work. It still draws people to a movement to have nonviolent protest that's well organized with a message and with a goal. I want to say about that little PNC protest that they did get PNC Bank to stop funding that mountaintop removal. So it can happen, but you have to have a goal. You have to be organized and be prepared.
Thank you. And I want to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and experience with us tonight. And now I'm going to open it up to you all, and if you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to ask.
Yes, I didn't really read the details on this, but the recent protest, I think it was in Berkeley with Trump protesters and anti-Trump protesters. What went wrong there? I didn't know.
Well, from what I understand, and other folks can correct me, they were protesting the conservative speaker, and it sounds like there were outside agitators brought in. So I think there were folks who were brought in to kind of make the lefties look bad, but that's what I understood. So I think you got to be careful about optics, for sure. So I think it was pretty straightforward what happened.
So what do you do if something like that happening? You know, some outside group being brought in to purposely agitate. How do you deal with something?
Well, my guess is those folks didn't really realize what was happening at the moment, but I don't know. I think you got to figure out, if you think that might happen, I guess some way to suck the air out of your own action, but I don't know. Did you want to weigh in there?
We've just seen it happen here in South Bend. Like when we had the city council, now it was the county council, was trying to pass the human rights ordinance. There was all these people from outside of South Bend that came and spoke. And one thing is just to point it out, you know, like these people aren't even from our community, and they're coming in trying to dictate our legislation, you know. But I do think that's common, and we see it happen a lot. I've seen it happen a lot with reproductive rights work, people coming in from rural areas to protest.
I've encountered the Klan, for example, coming to the Martin Luther King Memorial March, which really is a symbolic march in many ways, but it can feel kind of scary when they're there observing. So putting at least the air of fearlessness and friendliness as one goes about what one is planning to do is important there. Diane Nash definitely said she felt the fear and did it anyway. She would sweat every time because she knew it wasn't always going to be easy and could be dangerous, very dangerous. But I also think, you know, handling some of the publicity afterwards can be just as important. There was another protest in Seattle where, again, there was this speaker who was very right-wing to the point of fascism and discrimination against people, and people were protesting him. And then one of the people who was one of the peace marshals got shot. But they kept like playing it like, oh, well, maybe he was fighting or had a gun. But no, I mean, it was clear the story was he was actually a peacekeeper who was trying to keep the person with the gun who shot him from, coming near the others. So sometimes it is very hard, and sometimes people give their lives. And he is so committed to nonviolence. This IWW member who was shot, that he's not prosecuting that person. He says he has hope that person will convert, and he doesn't believe in the prison system that's going to change that person. Sometimes you hear of things going wrong, but it's often like April said, that somebody who is on the other side is causing that.
And you have to be aware that your message could be co-opted by your opponents, and how and you have to prepare for that. And I don't know the details either about that stuff in California. I don't know who was speaking where that stuff happened, but.
Bright Park guy.
Right, I mean, and right now, I think a lot of that's gonna be happening, in which it's gonna get quickly co-opted. Matter of fact, I think I saw this afternoon that Ann Coulter has been disinvited at UCal Berkeley. And so, okay, fine, you protested that, but what's gonna happen? Is that gonna get co-opted? Are you gonna be made to look like you're the ones who are anti-democratic? That you won't allow voice, or so you have to be prepared?
Yeah, I just want to make a case and ask specifically about the very low level of militancy locally. That, to me, the idea of a rally, including the January 20th rally, was not only to show our unity around a specific set of issues or set of feelings, but also make people think. And sometimes you have to make them uncomfortable in order to think, which means you might have to walk out into the street. I thought that was a terrible tactic to stay on the sidewalks, because we need to make people understand and make them uncomfortable so that they will think. I mean, during the Vietnam War days, we marched and we rallied and we petitioned and we taught in, and at some point we had to start pushing it. And we are there already, but we're not pushing it. We're still being sweet. And I don't think that's a good thing to do, frankly.
Well, I'll just say at
God,
that
react to
rally,
me, you
at
know.
that rally on January 21st, there were lots and lots and lots of children.
Oh, yeah.
And it mattered that we kept people safe. So, you know,
And
we
there
might
were
have a
so
different
many
rally.
people, there was no way in the world that anyone was going to run their car into a, you know, into a crowd.
Well, we had threats that people would.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, really, like, we had threats that people would online, that people were sharing, saying, I'm going to drive my car into the crowd. So we were extremely careful. I mean, we did not publicize that, but it was scary what we were seeing online, and
That
so
will
we were
always
very
happen.
careful.
But
Okay, well, we erred on the side of caution, and I'm not sorry.
Let's go ahead and move on to the next question.
Well, I think you also have to ask the question, who gets to walk in the street? Is it people that are capable and allowed to, but that are not discriminated against, who have less of a possibility of being treated unfairly by government officials? Or is it everyone? And then when it is everyone, does everyone get the same treatment when they're arrested, when they're killed, when they are in a situation where they can't protect themselves or their family? So when you were protesting, you have to decide, is it the logic that's important or the effectiveness? Do you die and no one cares? Or do you live and continue marching or protesting until somebody listens to you? You can't do both sometimes. So when you gotta pick.
Very excellent point, thank you. I think you had a question?
Actually, it's more of a comment. One of the things that wasn't brought up is, I think the biggest protest of all is voting. And 45 million people stayed home, registered voters, stayed home on their rear ends and didn't vote. And I had a reporter come up to me, a very young reporter, and say, so what do you think about elections? And I said, I vote in every single one, even if there's a candidate where I'm trying to figure out the worst of two evils, because I remember that people died for my right to vote. Died. I always respect the shoulders that came before me. I had a cousin who was on those freedom rides. They wrote their will before they left, just to keep that in mind. Incredible courage. And so even if people don't feel like protesting in the streets, I always encourage them to protest at the voting booth and make sure, you know, privately or whatever, even though I cancel out my husband's vote most of the time, vote, register and vote. I mean, get people registered and remind them to get their absentee ballot in time or whatever it takes. I think that's the biggest protest we need of all, is voting.
Very true. Yes, in the back? Sir.
this one, especially the LE bit of the whole panel. I've been a supporter of the LGBT community for years. The African American community, Black Lives Matters, have done a lot of protests. The Women's March. There seems to be a disconnect sometimes in bringing different groups together. So you could go to a Black Lives Matter event and not get a lot of people out from other communities. I know, like the Trayvon Martin March a few years ago, like I felt very outnumbered there, and I couldn't believe why there was nobody else there. So I'm just wondering, for you guys as organizers, how much do you guys put into trying to reach out beyond just my limited group and actually expand to reach out with other organizations and try to include other people?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
So that's a great question, and I mentioned that coalition building, and I think I'm seeing after the election, especially, those conversations happening more than ever, and these coalitions starting to, like the group who planned the event, the People's Inauguration, included Black Lives Matter South Bend, included every, the Islamic Society of Michiana, the LGBTQ Center, Pro-Choice South Bend, I could go on and on. And that group is continuing to meet monthly and we're working on trying to get a joint calendar that has everyone's events, so we're not double booking, and that we can support each other and show up for other people's stuff. But those conversations are not easy. One of my friends, I would call him now, I met, he's part of the New Black Power movement, and we met because we got in a disagreement with each other. So, and he introduced me that way to someone recently. Like, yeah, that's right, we did meet over arguing about abortion after a panel, But for me, that conversation, I learned so much. But I don't think it's easy, and there's a lot of criticism that is out there, and a lot of it's valid. But those people who are making the critiques, saying I was upset about the Women's March because it felt like it was just all white women. I'm like, well, where were you during the planning meetings, and who did you bring with the march? Who did you bring with you? Who are your friends you brought along? So turning that question back around, well, what can you do to help change that? Because it takes all of us. But I'm so impressed with the coalition building, and I've met so many great friends and colleagues and fellow activists doing this work. And for me, intersectionality and all of these identities working together is the heart of everything we're trying to do.
I want to get to more questions, because I think that's a great answer.
Yes,
Have you guys kept an eye on different legislation that has been introduced to block protests, specifically Senate Bill 285, that a lot of states were joining in to make it illegal for certain people to vote? I know I had to go before my membership and warn them because they were very passionate and very angry that if you were an immigrant, that could flag you in being looked at and your green card being pulled. So just be careful. It's okay to peacefully protest, but if it starts to take an ugly turn, you shouldn't be that person that's out in the street, because you're going to be the one to get flagged.
I think we really do have to keep an eye on legislation. That's why voting and paying attention to those things, because they are trying to pass, there are people in the legislature trying to stifle protest. I was horrified to see a bill proposed by a member of the Indiana legislature that said that it would not be a crime to run over someone in a protest.
Yeah.
And that's a deadly threat, basically, that if your protest does get too big, and I was in the street during the Women's March, I didn't get the message, and we were sort of dancing at the end there, just sort of hanging out, and my daughter was with me, and I was trying to keep her away, but it was hard because there were other people that were also there, and then I read this in the paper that, that and I think it's been modified, but it's still out there, so I don't know the number. I'm so glad you know the number of that one. That's the kind of thing that in our coalitions we really need to keep track of. It affects every group, and regardless of your political views that, it should not be a crime punishable by death to be in the street. And that's what it is if someone's allowed to run over you with impunity.
Right. I thought that was North Dakota.
No, we have some.
I thought the one in Indiana was
They
that it
copied
would
it.
authorize the police to use any means necessary to clear streets. There was actually a bill in North Dakota that would have made it justifiable if you had a vehicular accident with and the person had been occupying the road. Those are manifestations of the other side of Sydney Make Me Do It. Those who don't want that pressure. So in Indiana, in which the politics are such that we can't pass legislation that is going to be progressive, they're trying to tamp it down by addressing exactly what we're talking about here, because that's the power we have now. We don't have electoral power, we don't have enough friendly voices in the General Assembly, so they're going to try to stifle voices in the street. So you have to be aware of how that's working.
Our kids, the other thing, were encouraged, even, I can't believe that they actually proposed a bill like this. What gives them the courage? How can we combat that courage?
They win elections. Overwhelmingly, that's what gives them the courage.
God,
That's the problem.
where's common sense in this country? Is it gone?
Yes. Turn on the news.
Well, we're all here. Doesn't this make you feel better?
Yeah.
Evan.
We're the majority. Yeah.
All right, so I have a little bit of a combo question, and my question is, are protests now easier to ignore because of all the different policies that guide it? And the other side of the question is, what is the value of like being disruptive in like a protest?
When you choose to be disruptive, it's kind of what my friend David is talking about. It kind of makes the message a little bit stronger, or that it's going to be. One of our problems now, although it used to be that you weren't heard at all, now there is such a cacophony of voices, you can't be heard above the noise. And so how do you get that message out? Well, you try to do something very dramatic. And that's why people may choose to do that, in order to make that message heard. But you are right, sometimes that very technique is going to work against you.
Yeah, but they're one of the most effective techniques, unique techniques that I've ever seen. And I don't know whether you remember Jim Engel, but the skinny Santa Claus during the Reagan years got in the paper about a dozen times because he was gone. He was 6 feet tall and he was gone. And he sold apples, and he had a sign, and it was very specific, it was very nonviolent, but it was incredibly powerful. A lot of people remember that. Just like the pedal thing during Lyndon Johnson and Goldwater.
Famous television game.
Yeah.
I think being creative is important. Puppets can be very interesting and eye-catching. Artists have a role in protests. So sometimes to stand out in the crowd, it takes, and knowing your songs, April and I were talking about this, if you're going to sing a protest song, making sure you know the words and that your message is, again, there, getting out effectively and makes sense. Yeah.
I think too, we talked about this cacophony, that now it seems like there's so many protests and the disruptive ones are getting a lot of attention. But I think their most effective protests I've seen, thinking like internationally even, are protests that focus on local issues, and that's where change is still so possible and tangible. Is, the local human rights ordinance, things that are happening right here in South Bend, lead paint. There's so many issues that we can all rally behind that are nonpartisan, at least they should be. But I think focusing on local solutions and disruption is powerful.
I'd like to second what our fellow audience member said about voting, and I think I read in the paper this morning that Indiana was dead last in percentage of registered voting.
2014.
Yeah. So we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And usually the better years were like in the low 40s.
Yeah.
And
We
we should
outdid
be
ourselves.
registering people now, you know, now.
So join the League of Women Voters.
Yes, join the League of Women Voters.
They are doing super heroic work all over our community in high schools, educating young voters and registering them. So that you can be part of that coalition.
I'm a proud man.
They're very well trained, yeah, so am I. So
I just want to remind everybody, it goes along with the message you're trying to put across when we are protesting. It'll be my very first protest, but Saturday for the Science March.
Oh, good. I was hoping someone, Dean's here as well.
Oh, yeah, I'll be there. I have next day t-shirts and pins to my daughters down at IU. But we got to clean up after each other.
Yes.
Same with the climate march the following Saturday. We can't be out voicing our hearts out and leaving crud all over the roads when we're done, because they take that and they turn it against you on the social media and the newspapers, and we can't have that happen. So I'd read, take a bag with you. If you see something, pick it up, cart it out. Just like going to a national park. You take it in, you take it out with you. You don't leave it on the ground. And that's a message in itself.
Yeah.
So just a reminder on that.
And well, those who are planning the Science March, could you say a little bit about the specs of that? It's 2 to 6 this Saturday.
I think I've been planning all along to go to Indy, and
Okay, well, Dean is here. He's a local organizer. Do you want to say?
The event begins at 2 at Howard Park. There'll be a sign creation activity and general organization, and then a march along the Riverwalk and sidewalks to the John F. Plaza. And then there'll be teach-in and some speakers to conclude there. So the overall time is from 2 until 6.
So something for everybody to do, which you're doing all of the things, but that's part of course, all of the marches that are happening. And I'm so proud that our community is, alive and doing all of these things that links us to the larger protests as well.
I just have a brief question about the performance protests. Like, we've been talking about being more boisterous and being more loud and getting our attention out there. But if everyone's doing that, how effective has radio silence been towards protest? Like, how has maintaining a quiet, I don't know how to explain it.
Like a silent march?
Yes. Yeah.
That can be really powerful. Some of the most famous marches, one that happened in New York City after the attacks in St. Louis against blacks by a mob, there was a silent march through Harlem, which was very, very powerful. The silent march after the bombing of one of the lawyers of the students in the sit-ins, 3,000 people marching for an hour silently. Silence can be just as powerful as words.
But we used the Trayvon Martin March here in South Bend. There was at least a segment of it, not the whole thing, but we did purposely silent at a certain point.
In Istanbul, they had not only silent, but they just stood there. They didn't march. They just stood there silently,
So like a vigil.
meditating, closing their eyes, evenly spaced, just stood there.
So occupying public space can be incredibly
not
powerful.
saying anything because the Turkish government could have hauled them off, so they stood there.
All right, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and just remember to fill out your survey, and also let us know if you would like to attend the reception we're having next week by RSVPing. I don't really care if you've been to one or all 6. We want you there. Time to mix and mingle, make some connections, and just have some fun. So thank you very much.